Hello, everyone, and welcome to a post playthrough commentary on No One Lives Under the Lighthouse. This is something that I always feel compelled to do after I finish playing one of these games because I kind of try to give a little bit of a retrospective on everything we've been through during the credits, and it just never works. I'm always so overwhelmed by all the stuff that I have to think about that I never end up doing it proper justice. I think particularly for this one. I mean, this was a game that really confused me towards the end. I just had no conception of what was going on, and I only feel like I understood it less once I read the TV tropes page and realized that there are so many possible interpretations of that ending that I just never even had occur to me. All throughout, I referred to it as a faux PS1 style horror game, and while it certainly does utilize the PS1 style to great effect, I think it's actually kind of reductive just to call it a horror game. It was actually very similar in tone to the movie Session 9, and I don't know if that's really making sense, but that's how I felt about it. Like it's a lot more on the psychological side of things, especially as it progressed. Part of the reason I feel that way is because it leaves a lot up to interpretation. I think you're supposed to spend a lot of this game kind of in your own head, which, as I said during the playthrough, you could not have picked a better setting for that to be the case. I mean, with Lighthouse Keepers, especially back in the day, it takes a toll on your sanity. Normally they'd have a partner, but in this case, we don't even have that. And in real life, as we found out in some kind of infamous instances, even having a partner isn't always enough. But here, we were truly alone. This is why I think it's so important that these job simulator type games have us actually establish a routine where we have to do all these duties during the course of a given day, and why it's also important to have it take place over multiple days. When you do it like that, it allows you to, I've talked about this a million times before, but I feel like I've never really hit exactly what I'm going on about. When you have this routine, and when there's a decent amount of complexity to it, it makes it feel like, yes, there may be odd things happening, but first and foremost, the primary thing on my mind is that I have a job to do. So the scary moments are treated more as distractions that I'm forced to push to the back of my mind, which is basically what happens when you work a real job. In most horror games, you'll be doing some task, and then something spooky will happen and you'll have to go investigate. Here, if you do investigate, and you rarely have to investigate, it'll only be a momentary distraction from your work. But then it's back to work because at the end of the day, you have a job to do, and it's an important job. So even though you now have knowledge that something strange is going on here, you pretty much just have to think about that as a secondary thing while you go about your work. And that allows it to really wear on you in a way that I don't think a lot of horror games allow. Because after a while, you do start to question your sanity. Most of the scares are subtle enough that they're not something that would make you scream in terror and abandon your post. For the most part, it's minor things. Oh, the roof collapsed. I heard something fall in the other room. Oh, the sandbags dropped. All things that could be attributed to another presence on the island besides you. But which don't have to be. These are all things that could just happen on your own. And they all happen in and around moments where you're going to sleep. And in that way, it casts doubt. Did I dream it? Did I hallucinate it? The scares that I appreciated the most were the most subtle of them. The ones that you couldn't even be sure really happened. The ones where it's like, did I really just see that? Or did I really hear something drop in the other room? Because I think what nautical horror is all about is the stories that a bored and superstitious mind will tell itself. That is, of course, except for the series of scares that started surprisingly early on, involving those chases with the spider creature. Now, those segments were really jarring to me, because they seemed really unsubtle for something that had been so subtle up until that point, and continued to be subtle with the exception of those scenes. But that's what led me to suspect that they were going somewhere with that. Because this game had built up so much goodwill, I was kind of willing to be a little bit more forgiving of it, a little bit more willing to hold my tongue and see where it goes. And in the end, it ended up being kind of critical. I got the feeling early on that there was something up with perception and the identity of the player character, due to the fact that instead of having a traditional chase, it had me play it through the eyes of the monster itself, which seemed like a really strange choice. I would have been a little bit disappointed if it was just a way to make it so that I didn't get a good look at the monster early on. But in the end, it brought us to that place where the reason it's showing us this is because the monster kind of is me. That we're like, from what I could tell, we're a lighthouse keeper who is kind of being forced to, I guess, relive his sins until he can maybe make peace with it, or I don't know. It's still really confusing to me, and that's why I had so much difficulty commenting on it towards the end. One thing that was kind of funny with this playthrough was the matter of the eye that I kept seeing under the lantern chamber. Now, yes, I know that it's supposed to be the record player. I didn't realize that until I was editing part 2. Of course, by that time, all 3 parts had already been recorded. But here's my defense of that. The first time I saw it was, I don't remember if it was maybe the first or second night starting the light, but when I went to go back downstairs, it did that scripted sequence where my character kind of doubled over, and in that moment, I was forced to look down the grate, and that was the first time I saw it. So it seemed to me that my attention was being directed to it, which is why I was more inclined to believe that it was something that was supposed to scare me. Now, of course, I do think now that it was the record player. However, if I really wanted to go full conspiracy nut on this, there is actually something in part 3 which kind of supports my argument that we had ourselves a looky-loo. Now, granted, I don't actually believe this is the case. I think it's an oversight, but I'm still going to use it in my defense. During the scenes towards the end where we would be kind of brought back and forth between the Nether Fortress and the lighthouse, there were several times where I could look down through the grate and see the record player, but then when I'd climb down, it wouldn't be there. Now that's probably just there to stop me from like ruining the mood and turning on the record player and playing music. And it's probably just an oversight due to not removing it from the separate instance of the room upstairs. However, the actual gameplay effect is that I could see it through the grate, but it wasn't there when I climbed down. So there. Now, one sequence that I find really, really fascinating, and I would love to hear more interpretations on, because I find it so creepy in a David Lynch kind of way, is that ending part where the old lighthouse keeper talks about the dream he had about his son. I have never before in a game experienced a better application of dream logic, and that growing feeling of just unspecific dread, but it allows itself to build over its short time span. It acknowledges an aspect of dream logic that I don't know if I've ever seen anything acknowledge, which is the idea of just knowing something. It's looking up and finding the old lighthouse keeper, who in this case is the narrator, but experiencing it from the perspective of the son, and just looking up from the conversation and finding him gone, and saying, "I went to look for you in the other room because I knew you were there." That sentence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I feel like the pacing of the sequence and the tone of the narration and the lighting in the room and the soundscape that plays, it all contributes to this very unspecific feeling of dread. A creepiness and also like this regretful sadness to it that's very hard to explain, but I feel like if you just watch the sequence, you'll get it. It certainly came across when I was playing it. It caps it off with an incredible jump scare to end the game on, which is you slowly make your way into the other room, and you see that it's now completely unfurnished except for a table with a book on it, and you walk up, pick up the book, nothing happens, and you're probably going to sit there confused for a few seconds like, what did that do to me? And then when you finally turn around, the spider monster is standing right there in the room behind you, but the game just cuts to black right as it comes into your view, before you've even had a chance to register that it's there. And the best part is that it's completely soundless. So the heart attack that you have is 100% internal. It doesn't even give you the validation of a scare cord. Speaking of the dreamlike elements, there was something about the visions that we started to see towards the end. The old village that was on the island, which I don't know if that's supposed to be something that never existed or something that did exist in the past. But there was something about it that kind of had this very oppressive air of just, I don't know, inevitability. There was something about the tone that I felt while walking around this place and talking to the villagers who all speak in these, like, cryptic Bible verses and such. It made it all feel like I'm just seeing something that has happened before and will happen again. Which is supported by the idea I had that this is all like some kind of time loop where I am every iteration of the lighthouse keeper, and that all of this exists possibly just as some kind of purgatory or maybe punishment for me. I couldn't help but notice that the sound of the banging on the lighthouse door that's meant to scare you at several moments is a very similar sound effect to the one that plays when you're knocking on doors in the village. Now, it could just be reusing sound effects, but I feel like it's kind of meant to be recognizable, like you're supposed to realize that it's an echo of something that you've heard before. Especially if you knock on doors towards the end and you start getting dialogue, yelling like, "Where is he?" like, "I know you're in here." All in all, I'm really interested in hearing your guys' interpretations because even a few days later and thinking about it some more, I still feel so confused by that whole final hour. But then again, I clearly got the bad ending. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe I'm supposed to feel like I have to go back and play it again in order to get some answers. Because it seemed in the church segment at the end that I was basically being told, okay, you didn't learn your lesson, you have to go back and start the cycle again. So maybe that's on a meta level what you're supposed to do. Maybe you're actually supposed to go back and play it over and over again until you figure out what you're supposed to do and unlock that good ending. In that way, I really have to once again praise the developers because they could not have chosen a better setting to tell this story. Imagine the boredom and the monotony and the repetition that comes with being a lighthouse keeper, where you just do the same thing day in and day out for months at a time. What better framing could there be for telling a story about a time loop? I hope you enjoyed this playthrough as much as I did, even if it did leave me completely and utterly confused. But like I said, I am very willing to hear your interpretations because I'm super curious about this game. In the meantime, I hope you'll join me for the next playthrough, which will most likely be Resident Evil Village.